Hi and welcome back. This is another feature in my series called Going Modular. And in all of these videos, I'm trying to focus on some of the unique things that you might encounter in your journeys with your rack or modular synthesis. Of course, in all these videos, I always tell you that, one of the cool things about the modular journey is that it allows you to be experimental, to make mistakes, to try some new things that maybe typically you couldn't do in other systems, whether it's your VSTs on your computer, a workstation, or something that is more traditional in terms of synthesis or music technology. So this particular video is on drums and percussion, and I do not intend this to be a video that focuses on how to create dynamic drum patterns or things of that nature, but really more on how you can utilize a Eurorack modular setup in some ways to do dynamic things with percussion and drums, to do experimental things, to create rhythms and divisions and new approaches to thinking about rhythm that I would argue could not be done in other systems. And I don't intend in this video series to focus on an order, if you will, of these videos. But I think this would be a good one to start with early, because really what I'm doing here I don't think you can do in other setups, say in Ableton or with your MIDI gear. You could recreate these sounds, but for me, there's something generative and organic about what we're doing here today. So let me first explain step one of this, and I believe step one of this would be to say we need to create some sounds. And let me just put a little more light on the subject here. So step one of this is saying, let's create sounds using modules that are rhythmic in nature, percussive in nature. So obviously you could purchase a slew of modules out there that are very specifically focused on drums. I know Erica has a new, I think it's their techno system that just came out. That sounds amazing. If you want to do 808 or 909 replication, there are so many modules out there. 2HP has a series, Erica has a series. With 2HP, for example, you could get the hi-hat module, and that has some amazing sounds that DivKid reviewed not too long ago. I'm actually not doing that, so let me explain what I'm doing here. So I have 4 modules I'm using today for my percussion, and then we'll expand beyond that. But what I did was I started to build a drum or percussion setup based on, I think, some non-traditional sounds. So I have 4 modules here. The first one is the carp, and this is a really, I think, experimental and interesting sounding module. To me, at its core, it sounds like a detuned or very harsh harpsichord, and I think you'll hear some of that later. That will be one of my sound sources. The remaining 3, it's the same module. It's the Mofenzief Muskrat. I got a little obsessed with this. I bought one of these used on reverb.com, and then I started to look at the potential of it, and I thought, oh, I could really use 1 or 2 more. I ended up getting 2 more. Perfect Circuit was running a sale for Black Friday, so I got a really good discount. And the other thing that influenced me to do this was having purchased these expansion chips. They're kind of hard to see here, but they're chips that plug into the back of the module. And I also have an MSG, which is their desktop unit. And the MSG, it's essentially a drone device. You can also open up the back and put in the expansion chips. And so buying the expansion chips set for $30, I thought this is a great way to customize modules, to essentially take the same module that I really appreciate the functionality of, but to change up the sounds. And so what you'll be hearing is, I believe the middle one is the stock, the right one I think is the wavetable synthesis chip, and then the leftmost one here is the FM synthesis chip. So each of these has a different unique quality in terms of the sound, what we call the timbre of the instrument in traditional music. So what I'm attempting to do then is to take 4 of these modules and say this will be the core of my percussion, my drums, if you will, in my Eurorack setup. You'll probably note, well, none of these are traditional drum sounding voices. Now, of course, through the use of pitch, through the use of detuning, through different modulation. I can easily decay, of course, which is this knob here. I can easily create something, even with no white noise, right? I can make something that sounds like a hi-hat or a snare drum. A kick drum, right, is a little bit different in terms of the frequencies and the harmonics, but I have some other modules that can do that. So I'm going to be creating what in my mind are percussion parts, but using, I think, non-traditional modules to do that. So I'm not initially going to be using some of my drum sounds that will say come from plates or plonk, and I will bring those in later just to demonstrate some other principles. So I think step one in creating drum parts or rhythm parts is obviously deciding what sound sources you want to use, and in later stages we'll get into how to tweak those sound sources. Okay, for step one then, let's simply patch all of our sound sources into our mixer. And I'm not going to worry too much about panning on this, so essentially I'm just going to take the mono output into my mixer, record that. I probably will add some subtle reverb maybe to the mix. Let's see how that goes. But I'm not going to worry about panning these. I know in some demo videos you get some really good opportunities to hear the different voices if they're panned left and right, center, whatever. So I'm not going to worry about that too much right now. I just want to do something pretty simple. And since I'm focusing on the totality of these four sounds in combination with one another, I'm not going to, I'm going to try to get the mix right here if possible. A lot of times when I record, I will take an eighth to quarter out into my mixer and record each of these tracks separately so that I have a little more control with the final mix. I'm not doing that today for the purposes of our demo. Okay, and then we'll have these, we'll just have to see what the levels are like. Okay, so obviously I'm just routing that. That's just my audio mix. Step two really is thinking about what do I want to use to generate rhythmic sources in my Eurorack modular setup. Of course, the answer to that is it could be just about anything. There are so many possibilities out there. One certainly is to use a sequencer. I could use my Hermid, which is a great Eurorack sequencer, one of my favorite ones. I could do that, and then I could actually play in drum parts, right? I could use any number of ways of inputting drum parts, whether a MIDI keyboard or some alternative like a pad or something like that, via USB, via MIDI. And then I could quantize that, and then that can become, of course, my rhythmic sources. I can alter that in a myriad of ways just using the sequencer, randomization, whatever. I'm not going to do that today. Another possibility in the pure random route is to use something like the Scion, hook it up to a plant. It's based on biometrics, and then I can do something really different and rhythmic. I can control the amount of, the number of notes, the density of notes coming out of the module, and I can take 4 CV gate sources and use that. I'm not going to do that today. So we'll start with this source here, and I have this patched up ahead of time. And we will then take that sort of, I guess, in step 3. It's so step 1 is deciding your sound. Step 2, what's going to create your gate or triggers to get your sound moving. And then step 3 will be further augmentation, further changes of those core rhythmic sources to allow for even more customization, as well as using the myriad inputs on, in this case, what I'm calling my drum or percussion modules to further augment the sound. So things like the decay, things like the actual patch that's coming through, distortion, whatever that happens to be. And that's why I say what you're doing here is so unique, I think, to the Eurorack modular setup. So I'm using the Pico trigger, and this is one of my favorite modules. It's so simple, it's really inexpensive. It gives me 4 outs that essentially will be different pulses of rhythm. This is all customizable using an app, and that app allows me then to store, I believe it's up to 8 different variations of rhythm. This is very simple, so I come from 1 down to 4 increasing rhythmic complexity. So we'll just take channel, the first one here, and plug it in. And you're hearing then the very first rhythmic source. And this is the FM module. Again, when you first hear that, you think, it doesn't really sound like percussion. I mean, it's rhythmic. Maybe the closest thing to it is it sounds somewhat like a cowbell or something like that, a synthetic cowbell. At the very initial stage, obviously with my first drum sound, I can control the decay, and that itself is obviously going to affect how we hear and perceive that particular rhythm. So then 2 will go into the next muskrat. And maybe what I'm going to do is just dial back the level on that one. I'm trying to get this right in this mix. We'll see how that goes. Okay, so again, I can alter that in a variety of ways. Again, doesn't sound like, it sounds like a synthetic sound. You don't think percussion necessarily. We'll do channel 3, the third and final muskrat. And this one, I'm going to adjust. Just going to try to find a sound that sounds right. Let's go with that one. Come back and adjust, say, the decay and some of the other parameters. And I'm trying to just hear if I like the levels there. I'm only doing that now because this is my final mix, since I'm only doing one channel out. And we'll take the last one into the carp. And I actually take that back. It sounds like my fourth trigger out is kind of giving me the upbeat, right? So the one channel, we've got 1 and 3 and then 2 and 4. So kind of a traditional 4/4 rhythm here that we're working with. Again, here I can also adjust the timbre. Might be getting a little harsh there. Yeah, so essentially that's, this is not rocket science or anything complex. It is our first rhythm, though, that we're generating. And what I hope to do over time is to really dive down and work with these 4 modules. As I said, we can very quickly change rhythms without patching another thing at all as far as an actual, say, clock source. And that's what's pretty cool about Eurorack, is the level of customization and variation possible just from very minor alterations. For example, I can use the switch at the bottom and immediately have some dramatic effects on my sounds. And this is all because of those chips again. The module you just heard here, our first muskrat, has the FM chip, so it really has cool synthetic sounds. So each of these already has a different character. I think what happens, say, with the traditional drum machine, like I remember in the old days of having an HR-16, an Alesis, and then later an SR-16, was that, and this is so obvious, right? You have a bass drum, a kick drum, you have a snare, you have a hi-hat, a cymbal. Each of those occupies different timbre locations, if you will, in our auditory perception of the sound, and they also have different frequencies, right? So your low resonant frequencies of a kick drum are different from what you hear with the upper frequencies of a hi-hat, a cymbal, a snare drum. So that itself, right, sort of suggests to us that we are pre-programmed to hear certain sounds occupying different timbre and frequency locations in terms of our perception of that sound. So very quickly, I can, as I said, alter the sound. I can do a little more with the carp maybe here. And this gets a little hard just from a production standpoint because I start to forget what sound is what. But you can hear that almost has like a more like a stick sound to it, what's coming from the carp through those alterations. For this particular purpose, it doesn't make a lot of sense to adjust the decay and make it longer because I think for me, percussion entails rhythm and some precision in terms of being able to hear those different parts playing. Okay, so in any case, we can do that infinitely, right? We could continue to experiment just with our voices and, you know, the possibilities. It really depends on your module as far as what you might want to work with and how you can work with it. But let's do some other things. Now, again, I'm just right now using this very simple trigger module, which to me illustrates that you don't need a lot to get started with modular. I can use this one module into my sound sources, and what I'm going to do next then is do some variations on that. So let's see. I was just having a little bit of a debate in my mind, like, well, what's the best way to approach this? I think what I'm going to do actually is add a few more voices just to show you some of the other possibilities out there in terms of percussion. The one I'm going to be using up here, actually it's a little hard to see, it's the Tip Top 1, and this is a sample playback module. We're going to put that into, we're up to channel 5. And I'm going to need my trigger source. And one of the things that I'm pretty notorious for doing, if you watch my videos, is using one of these. And this immediately basically can take your module, whether it's your CV gate signals coming out or your audio signals, and multiply that times 5. So it's one of the most economical ways to create additional outputs, variety, and so forth. So I think for the sake of simplicity, let's take our first channel. We're going to lose that FM voice, and we will just take that as our source. Okay, you hear it coming back. Again, what I said earlier almost sounds like a cowbell. You begin to see why you need numerous cables. So let's take that source and we will go in. Now, one of the things that's happening here, depending on the mode that I've selected on the sample player, on the tip top, this may actually not be in time. I might want to adjust the pitch and find a sound that's going to be conducive to what I'm trying to do with this rhythm. I'm trying to listen to that and see if it's a little bit off. For the purposes of our demo, I think it's going to be fine, but it has kind of a little dissonant flair to it. And I think always with experimentation, you can ask, you know, does it add anything to the rhythm that you're trying to create? So we can leave that for now, but I thought I'd bring in, let's do another split. We'll do our second channel from our Pico trigger. Hear that come back. that part. And then I'm taking this trigger off camera into plonk, and I have I think a hi-hat or a ride cymbal going here. We'll hear that coming up in a second. So you hear that part playing. Again, as I'm doing with my other modules, I can adjust the decay. And obviously just doing that affects its presence in the mix. And one of the things you probably know about if you're creating drum parts, if you're miking drums, further levels of complexity as far as trying to make sure that each of the rhythmic parts you have presence in your mix. They might start to occupy some of the drum parts. If they're occupying the same frequencies, your mix will obviously get washed out. I remember this playing in bands and working with some of my bandmates when we sat down trying to, say, mix drum parts, and those drum parts in combination with other parts where you have competition in the various bandwidths or frequency spectra that you have in a mix. So this doesn't come out very well, I don't think necessarily. It's maybe starting to get a little muddy. What I wanted to suggest here was let's hijack this process a little bit. So if you remember, I took let's just take the one sample out of there for a second. Maybe it's muddying the mix. I want to start with this point. So I essentially just split, or not split, I multiplied, I doubled my track 2 output, and it's going into the second muskrat and the plonk, which is off camera here, which is a great module. And I want to say, like with plonk and plates, you have modules out there that are quite more versatile than the muskrat. Again, the muskrat I like because of the character of its sound, but if you wanted to have a module like plonk that gives you synthesizer sounds, that gives you incredibly modeled acoustic instrument sounds and some amazing drums, you can't go wrong with that module. And also with that module, if you use one of the kits early, which are the first 5, I think, or so presets, you can trigger 2 at a time, which is a really cool feature. So you have that like paraphonic ability to have multiple drum sounds playing at once. So we're actually using that right now. And I'm going to take that output, and that's here. Okay, so you no longer hear this cymbal. I'm going to plug it into the 2 HP divider module, div, and you'll hear it come back now. Let's raise the volume a little bit. And you can tell then what happened. The rhythm changed, right? Because I'm further modifying that clock source. Okay, so listen to that high, it's called open ride, right? It's a pretty high-pitched sound you hear there. And what I can do is, I'm just adjusting, let me do this, hold on. It's bad form not to show you. I was trying to just focus on the one case here. But, okay, so what I'm doing here is just adjusting the rate. And it gets a little out of control up here, right? So if we go back down, all I have to really do to get an interesting rhythm is just listen for something that is really into that groove, whatever I'm trying to create. And I like that quite a bit. And all I really did was take my signal, my original trigger out from that second channel of the Pico trigger, put in the divider module, and essentially I just adjusted the rate until I got it where I wanted it to be. And just for the sake of simplicity and experimentation, we could do that. Yet another module, take our rhythm and put it into the 2 HP Turing machine. Okay, and it's a little hard to pick up in the mix, but essentially what I'm doing with these last 3 modules is creating variation, randomization, and different possibilities in terms of the rhythmic patterns. And you could mix this all up, right? You don't have to start with this module, but it just shows you that you can use so many modules in your Eurorack setup to create further rhythmic variety in terms of your overall mix. Now, I think one final source to look at of variation is to do something with the inputs on any of our sound sources. I'm not going to touch the Plonk. There's actually quite a few inputs. On the Muskrat, there are 4 I can work with on each module, and then there's another 4 as well on the Carp module. So I can take any number of sources. I could, for example, take the envelope output from my Erogenous Tones radar, and I just have one of my handy multiples as well again. And this is pure randomness, right? This is one of the fun things about modulars. We don't know what's going to be affected or how it's going to sound. Let's just start patching in. You hear that immediate change in the FM voice. It's channel 1. It's really quite different. Second Muskrat. Subtle change there. Third one. And the Carp. And of course, I can alter this up. I could do this 4 times for each of these modules. So you start to think about the exponential nature of Eurorack in terms of rhythms, right? Not changing anything with the trigger sources, other than what I mentioned earlier, altering that up with some of these divider modules, the Euclid, the TM module, the Turing machine. I'm just essentially, though, altering the rhythm based on what I'm patching into each of these modules and modulating that. And of course, I could take my envelope generator, and alter that to my heart's content, right? So the possibilities there are numerous, endless at some level. Okay, and using that same approach, the obsession with our multiples, let's do that one more time because we have the opportunity here to have so many open inputs on our modules. I'm going to do one more thing. And that is to send. I'm going to use Chance, which is a very interesting clock generator. I'm going to take my original in the spaghetti bowl here, output as a clock source, and we're going to go in the clock in and Chance. And let's just go into some different inputs on our 4 modules. So a lot of things have happened there, right? You hear the timbre has radically changed on quite a few of the modules. In some ways, I like that the best, actually. And that's, I think, a lesson with Eurorack Modular, is that sometimes you start with something, and with a couple of additional patch points added, you absolutely have something new and unique. Yeah, I quite like that. It just has a totally different kind of funky sound to it. And of course, one of the challenges of any of this is that if I wanted to make notes of this and recreate this rhythm, I could do that. It would take a very long time to do that. You know, so I think part of what's kind of fun about what we're doing here is that there's a random organic nature to it. And, you know, the fact that I can't necessarily practically recreate this makes it, I think, pretty interesting. I'm thinking of just one more modulation, maybe. I'm getting a little bored with our cymbal. Okay, what I did was I was just getting bored with, because I put my signal into the Turing machine and the cymbal that's coming out of Planck, it wasn't triggering that often. And that's cool for variation, but I thought with the change in timbre, because of our modulations from both chance and the envelope generator from radar, the mix changed, right? It's like the timbre, some of the pitches seemed to lower, and the mix had a more bassier feel to it. So I thought maybe I need to bring the cymbal out a little bit more on Planck. But maybe I want to continue to change things up a bit. So let's go into Planck. And what I did was I took the wave out on chance and I went into the velocity input on Planck. And maybe you can still hear that. And maybe velocity is not the best there. And I don't know, I put that into the pitch input. Again, you can experiment as much as you want with all of your sounds, your modulation sources, and the variations. Now, and of course, up until this point, I haven't done anything with effects, and that's a whole entirely different side of my setup. If I wanted to, though, very quickly, let's take out channel 1, which is our FM sound, and we can just put that into the 2 HP freeze. It's off there with the rhythm, but it is certainly variation. What that is doing, of course, is creating kind of a glitch effect, and I can adjust the size of the sample and the rate of it. So you get these shifts not just with the rhythm, but with the pitch going on. So again, its opportunities are out there. I think when you're doing drums and percussion with Eurorack, as we talked about today, if you begin with your sound sources and think about what you want to accomplish in terms of the timbre, then shift into your generation of rhythm, what that will sound like, You can then, in step 3, think about taking different modules that will alter your rhythm, other clock modules, divider modules, and alter up and vary as we did today using the multiples here. And then the last step was taking our modulation inputs on our percussion modules, what I'm calling percussion modules today, and further changing the rhythm based on altering timbre, decay, pitch, distortion, and other parameters that are going to be specific to your modules that you have at hand. The last step would be adding effects to the mix. For example, if we throw a delay onto one of these channels, we have further opportunities for rhythmic variation with our drums and percussion. So that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed this feature and continue to check out some of my additional features on going modular here on my YouTube channel.